Behind the polished glass and gleaming marble of a prestigious bank, a quiet storm brews, one that will unravel everything hidden beneath the surface. A black woman, carrying more than just the weight of her past, finds herself trapped in a web of suspicion and cold dismissal, her very presence questioned without reason. What begins as subtle erasure escalates into a battle that will expose secrets no one wanted uncovered and force a reckoning that shakes the foundations of power itself. This is not just her story. It's a mirror reflecting the harsh realities faced by countless others silenced by invisibility. Watch closely, because the truth waiting to break free will change everything. If you're ready for a story that demands justice, hit like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from in the comments. The moment Nerissa Kane stepped through the bank's entrance, Calder Bryce, a tall, clean-shaven security guard, didn't just glance at her. He jotted something down on his internal clipboard, the one typically used for marking security risks. No greetings, no courtesy. A receptionist gave Nerissa a quick glance, then silently switched the internal status screen to unidentified guest in lobby handled discreetly. The lobby of Allcrest National Bank was pristine, almost surgical in its luxury. Marble floors gleamed under soft golden lighting, and everything from the elevator pings to the quiet murmurs of financial elites projected order. But for Nerissa, walking in with her 6-year-old daughter Amira, the space felt colder than sterile. It felt hostile. She had dressed carefully. Navy blazer, tailored slacks, conservative flats, and a soft scarf to cover the twist-out she'd worn that morning. Respectable, unthreatening. She had printed the appointment confirmation, tucked it into a portfolio, and even brought Amira's favorite rabbit toy to keep her calm. Everything about her presence had been meticulously curated to avoid misunderstanding. Still, it wasn't enough. Calder's eyes followed her from the moment she entered. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He simply noted her, judged her, then flagged her. She didn't see the mark, but she felt the weight of it settle in the air. Nerissa walked to the front desk, her heels quiet against the polished floor, Amira's small hand nestled in hers. The receptionist, a pale young man with gelled hair and a tight smile, glanced at her paper, took it from her fingers with hesitation, and tapped something into the screen. His eyes flicked up for a split second, over her shoulder toward the security post. "One moment, please," he said, voice clipped, then gestured vaguely toward a planter in the corner of the room. Not the plush chairs meant for waiting clients. Not the open lounge with warm lighting. A corner. Nerissa blinked, then offered a polite nod. She led Amira toward the planter and remained standing, refusing to shrink into the space assigned to her like an uninvited shadow. She didn't miss how a woman in a designer coat was ushered straight into the elevator without pause, or how another receptionist handed a bottle of sparkling water to a man in a pinstripe suit who had walked in after her. No one offered Nerissa anything. Not a seat, not an update, just the corner, just the cold. She shifted her weight, adjusting her daughter's coat, trying to keep Amira from fidgeting. 15 minutes passed, then 20. She approached the desk again, keeping her voice steady, controlled. "Excuse me, I had a 2 o'clock appointment with the community finance officer. I've been waiting a while." The receptionist didn't look at her at first. He seemed to take a breath, as if preparing to perform, then glanced up with a trained expression. "Someone will be with you shortly," he said. Then, as if she were interrupting something important, he lowered his eyes to his screen again. Nerissa stood there for a second, humiliated by the forced dismissal, before turning back. Calder was already there. He hadn't left his post near the elevators, but now he had moved closer, arms crossed, posture rigid. "Please stay behind the barrier," he said flatly. Without waiting for her response, he unhooked a velvet rope from its stanchion and repositioned it, just subtly enough to cut her off from the main walkway, just harsh enough to signal containment. Nerissa guided Amira behind the rope. Her daughter looked up, confused. "Why are we behind the line, Mommy?" Nerissa forced a smile. "So we don't block the path," she said softly. The lie tasted like rust. Amira clutched her rabbit tighter. Time crawled. Nerissa's back began to ache from standing. No one came. No one acknowledged her. A security staff member approached, and asked if she had checked in. She nodded. He didn't confirm it with the desk. He simply looked her over, then turned and walked away. The mark was still on her, visible in invisible ink. At one point, an older white man walked in wearing jeans and a windbreaker. He was greeted by name, offered coffee, laughed with the staff. A client. A real one. The receptionist stood straighter. Calder nodded to him. Nerissa watched, expression unreadable. When Amira sat down on the floor to rest her legs, Calder was back in seconds. Children should remain seated in the designated waiting areas. People who had arrived after her were already seated. Strangely, none of them seemed like they were waiting. Some scrolled through phones, others sipped bottled water, and one casually flipped through a magazine, though none had ever approached the desk. Every seat, in truth, had been silently blocked from her. The space had conspired to isolate her without uttering a word. She adjusted her stance and opted to stand once more, Amira by her side. Both of them just within the barrier Calder had set earlier. A new employee, a woman with a headset and clipboard, emerged from a hallway and scanned the lobby. Nerissa straightened, anticipating her name, a gesture, a single acknowledgement. Instead, the woman's gaze skimmed over her as if through glass, then called out, "Mr. Henley?" An older white man 2 feet away stood, nodded, and was immediately escorted through the private glass doors toward the executive wing. Nerissa remained frozen. Something inside her started to fray, like a thread pulled too tightly. She looked down at her daughter, whose face had begun to crumple from standing so long. "Just a little longer, baby," she whispered again, the words sounding thinner than before. That's when Calder returned. He walked with deliberate weight, pausing at the edge of the divider. "I'm going to need you to step away from this area," he said, not unkindly, but with an authority that dared contradiction. Nerissa blinked. "This area?" she asked, gesturing lightly around. "I'm just waiting to be seen." Calder's expression didn't shift. "You're obstructing access to the service zone. Please move to the outer lounge." He was directing her out of the reception lobby altogether, toward a side corridor lined with an ATM, a brochure rack, and a few unpadded chairs typically used by delivery personnel. Nerissa opened her mouth to protest, but stopped herself. She glanced at Amira, who now looked confused and nervous. She couldn't scare her daughter with conflict, not here. With slow, silent resignation, she led her child out of the central lobby and into the offshoot waiting area. Dimmer, removed, far from any visible staff. She sat, finally, on one of the metal chairs that creaked under her. Amira leaned against her, pressing her rabbit toy into her mother's side. Nerissa exhaled and stared at the muted television playing a silent stock market broadcast above the ATM. She checked the time again. 43 minutes past her appointment. No one had come. No one had called. Her name had never been spoken. Across the hallway, she noticed a young woman in a sharp pencil skirt approaching the reception desk. Her long brown hair was pulled into a sleek ponytail, and she wore high heels that clicked confidently across the floor. She smiled, greeted the staff warmly, and within seconds was being escorted upstairs. Nerissa watched it all happen in real time and realized something undeniable. Appointments weren't being honored. They were being filtered. She had not been forgotten. She had been ignored, intentionally, surgically. A man in a maintenance uniform approached the ATM, nodded politely, then hesitated as he noticed her sitting there. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. Nerissa tried to smile. "Yes, I had a 2 o'clock. The man gave a sympathetic shrug and turned away, saying nothing, offering nothing. It wasn't his job, and Nerissa didn't fault him. She sat in silence again, waiting. At that moment, her stomach churned, not from hunger, but from the realization that she was no longer being delayed. She was being denied. The denial didn't come through direct rejection, but through the slow erosion of acknowledgement. She no longer existed within the system of clients. She had been pushed out, rerouted to a space where the institution could forget her entirely. Her daughter tugged at her sleeve. "Mommy, are we going home now?" Nerissa swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "Not yet, honey." She placed a hand on her daughter's head, fingers threading through the soft curls, and tried to steady her breathing. The lobby was visible through the glass, and from where she sat, she could see a continued stream of customers, most of them white, enter, smile, be welcomed, and escorted upward or into private side offices within moments of arrival. Even those who hadn't scheduled appointments were being served. She had watched one woman say, "I was just in the area," and still get immediate assistance. Nerissa, in contrast, was exiled in plain sight, with no offense she could defend herself against, no proof she could present to change her status. The humiliation had transcended personal offense. It had become institutional, systemic, woven into the building itself. Then, an employee in a dark gray suit stepped into the lounge, holding a clipboard. Nerissa stood quickly, smoothing her clothes, ready to speak, ready to explain again that she had a confirmed meeting, printed and time-stamped. But the man never even looked at her. Instead, he addressed a delivery driver who had walked in seconds earlier and was holding a clipboard of his own. They exchanged a brief conversation about package sign-offs, and the suited employee walked back out without even glancing in Nerissa's direction. That was when something shifted inside her. The shame she had been swallowing all afternoon began to rot into something heavier, more painful, a gnawing awareness that what was happening was not incidental. It wasn't a busy day. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't oversight. It was method. It was hierarchy. It was dismissal built into the very architecture of the service she had come to receive. Her back straightened, but her chest ached. She could not leave. Not yet. Not without being seen. But she couldn't force her way in either, not without making a scene. And a scene would only confirm what they had silently already decided about her. She was, in their eyes, a risk, a disruption, a problem to be moved aside. The receptionist from earlier leaned over the desk and whispered to a colleague, both of them glancing toward the lounge where she sat. Their voices were too low to hear, but their gestures told the story. The colleague laughed quietly, covered his mouth with a folder, and typed something into the computer. Moments later, the television mounted above Nerissa's head in the lounge flickered and changed channels, switching from a financial news broadcast to a soft, generic warning screen that read, "Unauthorized activity will be reported to management." It wasn't directed at her specifically, but the timing was surgical, a soft threat in corporate language. She stared at the screen, trying to interpret whether it was an automated cycle or a silent warning. Then Calder appeared again, this time flanked by a second guard Nerissa hadn't seen before, a shorter man, stockier build, carrying a black clipboard and wearing an expression that was simultaneously blank and alert. They stopped just short of entering the lounge, standing at the edge like sentinels. Nerissa looked at them, heart thudding, wondering if they were here to escort her out entirely. She hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't refused to comply. But in this space, silence didn't protect her. Invisibility was not armor, it was ammunition. Amira stirred and sat up, looking at the men, then at her mother. Nerissa placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "It's okay," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. The second guard whispered something into Calder's ear, and Calder nodded. They didn't approach, didn't explain, just stood there watching for nearly a full minute before turning and walking away again. A performance, Nerissa realized. A silent message sent without dialogue, without context. She didn't belong, and they had the power to make that known through presence alone. The reception area buzzed with renewed activity. A large table near the middle of the lobby had been set up with a coffee urn and cups for a small gathering of what appeared to be wealth management clients. Nerissa could see their ID badges from afar. An assistant wheeled in a tray of pastries. Bottled water and sparkling drinks were set beside name cards. Someone handed out branded folders. She had received none of these things. She had not even been acknowledged as real. The most painful part was that she had dared to hope for more. She had imagined, just once, walking into this place and being treated like her presence was valid, like she belonged in the conversation about money, about legacy, about future. Instead, she was a ghost at the edge of their rituals. No name, no offering, no welcome. Then came the final sting of that hour. A janitor, young, no older than 20, came to clean a nearby trash bin. He looked at Nerissa and paused, as if unsure whether to address her. Then he spoke, awkward and low. "You waiting for someone?" Nerissa nodded, unable to trust her voice. The janitor glanced at the guards across the way, seemed to calculate something in his head, and then simply shrugged. "They don't like people hanging around, just so you know." Hanging around. The words weren't meant to be cruel, but they cut nonetheless. The television above the ATM flickered again, this time playing muted footage of some internal promotional loop. Images of smiling families, diverse faces shaking hands with advisors, young children touring the vault with awe in their eyes. The irony nearly made her laugh. The bank had crafted a fantasy of inclusion while performing a quiet execution of hers. Just as she shifted to adjust Amira's position on her lap, a different employee appeared from the corridor, this one wearing a visitor services badge and carrying a tablet. The woman walked directly into the outer lounge and paused when she saw Nerissa and her daughter. For a moment, Nerissa thought perhaps someone had finally acknowledged her. She sat up straighter, hopeful despite everything. But the woman's eyes narrowed slightly, and she gestured toward Amira, not with warmth or curiosity, but with rehearsed authority. "Excuse me," she said, her voice crisp and clipped. "This area is not designated for child occupancy. We ask that all minors remain in the family zone on the first floor." Nerissa blinked, stunned by the absurdity of the comment. "We're here for a meeting," she replied evenly. "We were directed here by security." The woman's lips pressed together into a tight line. "Regardless, this is not a child-safe area. I'll need you to relocate immediately." Nerissa stared at her for a beat too long, measuring her next words. To argue would bring security. To comply would affirm the accusation. Before she could decide, the woman had already turned and tapped something into her tablet. A notification pinged softly from somewhere behind the reception desk. Calder appeared less than a minute later. He approached with his usual steady pace, radio clipped to his shoulder, boots striking the marble like punctuation marks. "We've had a compliance alert," he said, without emotion. "You'll need to vacate this space and move your child to the appropriate area." Nerissa rose slowly, every movement controlled. "There is no family zone. We're waiting for a financial advisor. I had at 2 o'clock. We were told to wait here." Calder didn't respond. Instead, he turned and began walking, assuming she would follow. Nerissa hesitated. Amira had already stood, confused and blinking. She looked up at her mother, unsure whether they were being helped or removed. Nerissa picked up her portfolio, brushed the creases from her daughter's jacket, and followed Calder with measured steps. He didn't lead them back to the main lobby or to a service desk, but instead to a narrow alcove near the side entrance, an overflow space with 2 scratch chairs and a flickering light overhead. No reception desk, no view of the lobby, no sense of belonging. It was a forgotten pocket of the building, a space designed for waiting without witness. "You can stay here until someone calls you," Calder said, then walked off without further instruction. Nerissa sat. Amira hesitated, looking at the low, hard seat, then back at her mother. "Mommy, are we in trouble?" she asked, her voice small. Nerissa shook her head quickly, smiled without showing teeth, and pulled her daughter close. "No, baby. We're just waiting a little longer." She could feel the lie as she spoke it. It hung in the stale air like a cough. 10 minutes passed in silence. The light above them buzzed faintly. No one came. No one called. Across the corridor, a janitor wheeled a mop bucket past without looking in their direction. Nerissa tried to distract Amira by pointing out the art on the wall, a cheap print of an abstract landscape, but the child wasn't interested. She was beginning to sense the tension, the wrongness, the weight her mother was carrying. Amira sat down on the floor, pulling her legs to her chest, rabbit in her lap. Her legs were tired. Her face had gone flat and still. When a second employee walked past moments later, he stopped and looked down at the girl. "You can't sit there, sweetheart," he said, loud enough for others to hear. Then his eyes moved to Nerissa. "We have policies about floor seating. It's a tripping hazard." Nerissa opened her mouth to respond, but found no air behind her voice. Instead, she reached down, touched her daughter's arm, and gently pulled her up. "Come on, baby," she whispered. "Sit up here next to me." Amira obeyed without protest, but her eyes were clouded now with confusion and something else, shame. She was being scolded without understanding why. Treated like an infraction. Her mother could see it, and it shattered something inside her. The process wasn't just targeting Nerissa anymore. Now it had reached her daughter, soft and impressionable, who was too young to understand the rules she had never broken. Even the rabbit, now smudged from the floor, felt like a symbol of surrender. Nerissa wiped it clean with the edge of her sleeve and handed it back, but Amira only held it loosely. Another 10 minutes passed. A woman in a skirt suit walked by, talking into a headset. She glanced into the alcove and then quickly turned away. Nerissa had become a fixture, not a guest, not a client. Amira's head leaned against her shoulder, the child heavier now from fatigue and confusion, her little body beginning to slump with the weight of this invisible rejection. Nerissa's phone remained in her bag, untouched. She could call someone. She could complain. But the thought of explaining this, trying to name the unnamed, trying to justify why sitting in silence for over an hour was a kind of violence, felt like a trap. Any hint of confrontation would be used to confirm their suspicions. She would be labeled emotional, unstable, disruptive. She would be the problem, not the system, not the people who had made her vanish in plain sight. As she sat motionless, a group of bank employees passed nearby, laughing softly about something, their footsteps casual and confident. One of them, a young woman with a floral lanyard and coffee in hand, paused briefly when she noticed Nerissa in the corner. Her face shifted almost imperceptibly, but not with concern, with discomfort, embarrassment, the kind people have when they witness injustice, but are too complicit or too cowardly to intervene. She looked away quickly and kept walking. Nerissa caught her own reflection in the glass wall. Her shoulders were drawn in. Her face was drawn tight. She looked like a woman not waiting for help, but bracing for impact. She straightened up instinctively, trying to reclaim her shape, trying not to let them steal even her posture. But the moment felt hollow, as if her body no longer belonged to her in this space. Then the environment shifted again, not through action, but withdrawal. The muted television screen turned black. The thermostat kicked in colder air. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, then stayed dimmer than before. Even the subtle sounds from the lobby, typing, ringing conversation, felt further away now, like someone had dialed down her existence to minimum volume. A manufactured sensory isolation designed to fray the mind slowly. Nerissa glanced down at Amira, who was now fully asleep in her lap, the rabbit tucked beneath her chin. She could feel her daughter's breath against her arm, warm and steady, untouched by the cruelty surrounding them. For now. But Nerissa knew this would change. A child doesn't remain oblivious forever. The questions would come later, the self-doubt, the moments in school when the rules didn't seem to apply to her classmates the same way, the subtle conditioning that begins when the world teaches a girl she's unwanted before she even knows why. A flicker of motion caught Nerissa's eye. A man in a maintenance uniform entered the alcove carrying a small cart. He glanced at them, paused, and then veered to the side to replace a light bulb. He worked quickly, not speaking. Nerissa offered a nod of acknowledgement, but he didn't respond. Instead, he finished his task, wrote something in his logbook, and left without a word. It wasn't rudeness. It was policy. Interact as little as possible. Do your job. Don't ask questions. That was how this machine sustained itself, through layers of silence, obedience, and plausible deniability. A nearby speaker crackled faintly and emitted a vague announcement. Attention. Please remember that loitering in non-service areas is monitored for compliance. The voice was automated, gender-neutral, friendly. Nerissa sat still, the words ringing in her chest like a warning tailored just for her. She wasn't loitering. She had an appointment. She had proof. But no one had ever officially told her she wasn't welcome, and that made it worse. There was no complaint to file, no confrontation to replay. just a series of missing pieces, actions that hadn't been taken, words that hadn't been spoken, opportunities that had been methodically withheld. The kind of cruelty that can't be prosecuted because it hides in the empty spaces between what is said and what is done. Then she noticed the security camera. Small, discreet, tucked into the corner above the hallway. Its lens pointed almost directly at them. She had seen it earlier and thought nothing of it. Now she realized it had probably been recording the entire time. Every quiet humiliation, every reaction, every forced compliance. She wondered if someone had been watching, if someone had seen her daughter being corrected for sitting, seen the moment they were relocated like excess luggage. If someone had watched her sit in that chair and do nothing, say nothing, because silence was the safest thing she could give her daughter. Her skin crawled. She felt exposed. Not just watched, but dissected. Not a person, but a case study. An experiment in how long someone would endure before breaking. A door opened down the hallway. Nerissa looked up instinctively, hoping it might be for her. A woman in a black blazer stepped out, glancing briefly at the alcove. She checked a note on her tablet, then turned left and disappeared into another office. The front desk was quieter. The executive floor was no longer admitting clients. Most of the wealth management representatives had signed off, their desks vacated, their suits already halfway out the door. But Nerissa and Amira were still there, still waiting, as if the bank system had intentionally chosen to leave them behind. And then it happened, what felt like the last, calculated cruelty. Calder Bryce returned, walking with purpose down the hallway. But this time he wasn't alone. A woman in a midnight blue suit accompanied him, tablet in hand, face unreadable. They stopped a few feet from where Nerissa sat. The woman's tone was polite, but firm, like someone addressing a disturbance at a museum. "Ma'am, I need to ask if you have business at this bank today," she said. Nerissa looked up slowly, meeting her eyes, stunned. "I had a 2 o'clock appointment," she replied, voice hoarse from disuse. "Community finance officer. I checked in. I've been waiting." The woman didn't blink. "I understand," she said mechanically, "but we were unable to locate an appointment under your name in our system. Did you confirm it ahead of time?" Nerissa's heart dropped. Her fingers immediately reached for the portfolio on her lap, pulling out the printed confirmation she had carried with her all day like armor. She held it out, steady despite her shaking breath. "Right here," she said. "Confirmed yesterday. I have the reference number, name of the advisor, even the direct line." The woman took the paper and studied it with a neutrality, so cold it could only be learned through training. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "This appears to be a miscommunication. Unfortunately, the advisor listed is no longer available, and your appointment was not properly recorded in today's schedule." Nerissa stared at her, not understanding. "So it was real?" she asked. "But I wasn't seen because of a scheduling issue." The woman nodded once. "It happens. We apologize for the inconvenience." That was it. No further explanation. No admission of fault. Just a gentle nudge toward the door wrapped in professionalism. Calder remained silent beside her, arms crossed, waiting to see if she would resist. Nerissa could barely breathe. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. She looked down at Amira, who now stared up at the adults with wide, wary eyes, sensing the tension. Nerissa forced herself to stand slowly, carefully, lifting her daughter in her arms. Her knees buckled from stiffness, but she didn't stumble. The woman in the suit handed back the paper like it was a useless receipt and stepped aside. "Thank you for your patience. Please contact us if you'd like to reschedule." Nerissa wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the paper in their faces, to demand someone take responsibility, to shout so loudly that the pristine glass walls shattered and the truth poured out. But all she did was nod. She gathered her things, smoothed her daughter's coat, and walked past them with the grace of someone refusing to give them a show. She didn't look back. As she passed the reception desk, the same employee from earlier was still there, his gaze momentarily catching hers before flicking away, like she was nothing more than a smudge on the surface of his day. The lobby, which had once felt intimidating and alive with power, now felt like a stage set after the curtain had fallen. Lifeless, artificial, drained of illusion. Nerissa made her way to the revolving doors. Amira rested her head on her shoulder, too tired to ask questions now, but her silence carried the weight of everything she didn't understand. As they exited the building, the late afternoon sun hit them with a warmth that felt alien. Outside, the world moved as if nothing had happened. People chatted on phones, hailed taxis, drank lattes under sidewalk umbrellas. No one knew that inside the glass fortress, a woman and her daughter had been systematically dismantled and discarded. Nerissa stood on the sidewalk, paralyzed for a moment, not sure whether to scream or cry or collapse. Instead, she breathed, in and out. But as she reached the edge of the plaza, her steps slowed. A quiet gravity pulled her to a stop near the circular stone fountain that gurgled in the center of the bank's courtyard. For a moment, she stood in place, unmoving, letting the murmur of the fountain fill the void where her pride had been moments ago. The wind stirred a few strands of her hair loose, brushing them across her cheek, and with one hand, she gently moved them aside. Then, something within her shifted. Not the return of anger, not even defiance. It was something colder, more deliberate, a slow, hard certainty that what had happened would not be swallowed. She lowered Amira gently onto a nearby bench, nestling the rabbit doll under her daughter's arm and wrapping her coat tighter. Amira murmured, but didn't fully wake. Nerissa crouched beside her and kissed her forehead. "I'll be right here, baby. Don't move." She stood, turned, and walked back toward the building. Not through the main doors this time, but around the side, past the line of service vehicles and loading bays, toward a small employees-only entrance tucked near the rear stairwell. The door had a keypad and badge access only. Nerissa didn't touch it. She didn't need to. Instead, she waited beside the wall, her body calm, still almost statuesque. A few moments later, two men in suits exited the doorway, mid-conversation. One of them noticed her and paused, clearly puzzled. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, already assuming she was lost. Nerissa tilted her head slightly, studied the man's face, and responded with only 5 words. "Tell Roderick Healy, I'm here." The man blinked. "I'm sorry, who Healy?" "Roderick, Assistant Regional Director of Allcrest Holdings. Tell him Nerissa Kane is outside. He'll know." Her tone was quiet but firm, a tone not used by someone begging to be seen, but someone who already had been. The man hesitated, eyebrows drawn. Something in her voice, her posture, the precision of the name she spoke struck a chord. He glanced at his colleague, then pulled out his phone. "Wait here," he said quickly. He disappeared back into the building. Nerissa remained in place, hands folded in front of her, breathing in the late summer air like it belonged to her again. Minutes passed. From inside, the rhythm of the bank shifted. Phone calls stopped. Conference doors closed. Staff stepped back from their desks. An invisible ripple had been sent through the chain of command, and it reached its destination faster than anyone expected. Less than 3 minutes later, the side door swung open again. This time, the man who exited wasn't confused. He wasn't dismissive. He wasn't smiling. Roderick Healy was in his late 50s, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his tailored suit crisp, his watch gleaming beneath a subtle cufflink. He stepped forward cautiously, searching her face for confirmation. "Ms. Kane?" he asked. Nerissa didn't smile. She didn't offer her hand. She simply nodded. "Hello, Mr. Healy." He hesitated for a beat too long. I wasn't aware you were coming in today." "Clearly," she replied, her voice unshaken. Behind Healy, another senior administrator lingered in the doorway, unsure whether to stay or retreat. Healy glanced over his shoulder and then stepped fully outside, motioning for them to give him privacy. "If I'd known you were visiting," he began, but Nerissa cut him off with a slight tilt of her head. "I had an appointment, not as your guest, but as a client." Your staff erased it. Healy looked genuinely flustered now. His eyes flicked toward the glass wall, as if trying to locate the problem retroactively. This should not have happened. I assure you I will personally look into." "Don't bother," Nerissa said. "You and I both know exactly what happened. I didn't come here for apologies." Her gaze was steady, surgical. "I came here to be seen. And now that I have your attention, I suggest you walk me inside before your institution faces something far more costly than discomfort." Healy's jaw worked, a flush creeping up his neck. But he didn't argue. He didn't call for security. He turned, held the door, and gestured for her to enter. Nerissa didn't move. "My daughter is asleep on the bench. She stays in your line of sight." Healy nodded, stepping aside. Nerissa followed him through the private door into a corridor reserved for senior staff and board members. Inside, the sterile air felt different now, warmer with recognition, sharper with unspoken panic. Employees paused as she passed, glancing with confusion at the unfamiliar woman walking beside their superior. The executives shuffled papers nervously, cleared throats, and exchanged glances as Nerissa's name hung silently in the air. Roderick broke the silence first, his voice tight but professional. "Ms. Kane, I want to sincerely apologize for the experience you and your daughter endured at our Allcrest branch today. It was unacceptable and does not represent the standards we hold ourselves to." Nerissa's eyes narrowed slightly, but she remained calm. "Apologies are a start, Mr. Healy, but they are insufficient. What I endured wasn't a mistake, it was systemic. And the damage isn't just personal. It reflects a culture of exclusion within this institution." Her words cut through the room like a knife, resonating with a weight no one could ignore. An assistant projected a slide onto the screen behind her, displaying a series of documents, appointment confirmations, internal emails, and a timeline of events meticulously compiled from Nerissa's phone records and the bank's own data. The room fell into an uneasy silence. One of the executives, a woman with sharp eyes named Claudia, leaned forward and asked, "Ms. Kane, can you clarify how you came to be waiting for over an hour without being seen despite having a confirmed appointment?" Nerissa nodded, taking a measured breath. "I was flagged immediately by security upon entry. From there, my access was restricted subtly but deliberately. I was moved away from the client areas, ignored by front desk staff, and relegated to a side lounge with my daughter. Any request for information was met with vague excuses or silence. It was as if my presence was an inconvenience to be managed, not a client to be served." Claudia's face flickered with discomfort. "This is deeply troubling," she admitted. Nerissa allowed herself a moment before continuing. "It is more than troubling. It's a symptom of an ingrained bias. A bias that operates quietly, invisibly, and harms people without overt confrontation. And my daughter, a 6-year-old girl, was not spared. She was told to sit on the floor, corrected publicly, and treated as if her existence was a disruption." The room shifted uneasily. Healy cleared his throat. "Ms. Kane, your experience shines a harsh light on areas where we clearly must improve. I assure you that an internal investigation will be launched immediately and appropriate actions will be taken." Nerissa's gaze swept over the gathered faces. "I will cooperate fully with the investigation, but I want more than promises. I want systemic change. I want training, accountability, and transparency. Not just for me, but for every client who has been sidelined quietly for too long." The executives nodded solemnly, but Nerissa sensed hesitation. She knew that bureaucracy often drowned urgency in layers of policy and procedure. Yet this time felt different. The gravity in the room was real, and it had shifted because she had made it shift. Minutes later, Healy introduced a senior compliance officer who outlined the next steps: reviewing surveillance footage, interviewing staff involved, and preparing a report for the board of directors. Nerissa listened carefully, noting the names, the timelines, the promises. As the meeting wound down, Roderick Healy stood and faced her directly. "Ms. Kane, thank you for bringing this to our attention. You have our commitment that no one will be ignored again like this." She stood too, steady and resolute. "I appreciate that, Mr. Healy. And I want to be clear, this isn't just about an apology or an investigation. This is about reclaiming dignity for every person who walks through your doors. It's about confronting uncomfortable truths and dismantling barriers that shouldn't exist." Outside the boardroom, Narissa felt a flicker of hope mingled with exhaustion. The HR director, a woman named Vivian Cole, sat across the desk with a file thick enough to weigh down the table. Calder's usually confident demeanor faltered as Vivian laid out the complaints and video evidence that had been compiled. Surveillance footage showing his restrictive stance at the lobby entrance, recorded radio communications indicating a deliberate protocol to monitor and isolate Narissa, and multiple witness statements describing his dismissive and intimidating behavior toward both Narissa and her daughter. Vivian's voice was measured but firm as she outlined the gravity of the situation. Mr. Bryce, the bank takes allegations of discrimination very seriously. These findings suggest violations of our Code of Conduct and anti-discrimination policies. Calder swallowed, his hands tightening into fists beneath the table. I was just doing my job, he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. You were enforcing exclusion, Mr. Bryce, Vivian replied crisply. There is a distinction. You will be suspended pending further investigation while we review all actions and responses. The word suspended echoed ominously in the room. Calder nodded stiffly, fully aware that this was far more than a routine reprimand. Meanwhile, the video clip showing Calder blocking Amira's path and ordering Narissa and her daughter away had leaked to social media through an anonymous whistleblower within the bank's IT department. Within hours, the clip went viral, drawing outrage from viewers nationwide. Comments flooded in, ranging from condemnation of the blatant racial profiling to calls for corporate accountability. Hashtags like #JusticeForNarissa and #StopBankDiscrimination trended on platforms like Twitter and Instagram. The bank's public relations team scrambled to craft a statement that balanced corporate responsibility with damage control. But the narrative had already been set by Narissa's story and the undeniable footage. A second security officer at the branch, identified as Mark Harris, who had been complicit in monitoring and sidelining Narissa, was also called in for questioning. His tone was defensive, but the mounting evidence left little room for denial. Both men faced the stark reality that their actions, whether motivated by institutional bias or personal prejudice, would no longer be shielded by silence or anonymity. Within days, Allcrest National Bank issued a formal apology to Narissa Kane, publicly acknowledging the failure of its staff to uphold standards of equal treatment and promising comprehensive reforms. The bank announced a partnership with civil rights organizations to provide training aimed at combating implicit bias and systemic discrimination. Narissa's courage and persistence had not only exposed the individual failures, but had shone a light on broader issues that the institution had ignored for too long. Internally, meetings were held to discuss how such a situation could have occurred and what preventive measures needed to be institutionalized. The senior management team, visibly shaken by the public backlash and internal turmoil, committed to reviewing hiring, training, and oversight policies, especially concerning frontline security and customer service staff. But for Calder Bryce and Mark Harris, the consequences went beyond suspension or retraining. Their reputations were irreparably damaged. Professional references evaporated, and their roles within the security industry became subject to scrutiny. Private conversations leaked suggesting potential legal actions, both civil and criminal, related to discriminatory practices. For Narissa, the battle was far from over. She had turned the tide, but the scars of humiliation and rejection lingered. Yet, standing at the forefront of a movement demanding accountability and change gave her renewed strength. The weeks following the public exposure of Allcrest National Bank's discriminatory practices were a whirlwind for Narissa Kane. Media outlets clamored for interviews, advocacy groups reached out with offers of partnership, and social media remained abuzz with support and calls for change. Yet, amid the attention and the promise of reform, Narissa remained grounded in a purpose deeper than the headlines or the viral videos. She knew the battle was not simply about one incident or even one institution. It was about the countless unseen and unheard people who had faced similar indignities, whose voices had been stifled by silence and invisibility. On a crisp morning, Narissa stood outside a community center where she had been invited to speak at a financial literacy conference aimed at marginalized communities. The room was packed with faces reflecting the diversity and resilience of the city she called home. She looked out over the crowd and saw a mosaic of stories. Young mothers juggling multiple jobs, immigrants striving for stability, seniors navigating complex systems. She took a deep breath and began. "I didn't come here because I wanted to be a symbol. I came because I know what it feels like to be unseen, to be ignored by systems designed to help us. What happened to me was not unique. It was a reflection of a larger problem, a problem that only ends when we raise our voices and demand change." Her words resonated, not just as a recounting of her experience, but as a call to action. She spoke of dignity, equality, and the power of persistence. She shared practical advice on navigating financial institutions and how to advocate for oneself when the system feels stacked against you. But more than anything, she spoke of hope, a hope born from the hard-won victories of speaking truth to power. Back at Allcrest, changes were underway that would reshape the bank's culture and policies. The CEO publicly announced the creation of a Diversity and Inclusion Council, staffed with both external experts and community representatives, to oversee reforms and ensure accountability. Training programs on implicit bias became mandatory for all employees, and new channels were created for clients to report concerns anonymously and receive timely responses. Branches across the country began hosting workshops and outreach programs designed to build bridges with communities historically underserved or discriminated against. In Nerissa's own life, the aftermath of the ordeal brought unexpected opportunities. She was invited to join advisory boards, speak at national forums, and collaborate on initiatives focused on financial justice and equity. Yet despite the accolades, she never lost sight of what truly mattered: the everyday people who still faced barriers and the small victories that would eventually add up to systemic change. One afternoon, she sat with Amira at their kitchen table, helping her daughter with homework. Amira looked up, eyes bright. "Mommy, did people listen to you?" Nerissa smiled, her heart swelling. "Yes, baby, they did. And because of that, things are starting to change." The road ahead was long and winding, but Nerissa had learned that change often began in the quiet moments, in the refusal to be invisible, in the courage to be seen. Her story was no longer just her own, it belonged to a movement. And through that collective strength, a new narrative was being written, one where justice was not just a promise, but a lived reality. Nerissa knew the journey was far from over, but as she looked out at the horizon, she felt the fierce power of a voice that could no longer be ignored. The end. If you found this story compelling, please like and subscribe to stay updated with more powerful narratives like this. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the plot? Where are you watching from? Share your comments below and join the conversation.